And now, back to our interview with Mr. Ian Wingfield, former Solicitor General of Hong Kong. What kind of pressures are there from Chinese government regarding things like human rights or censorship? Is there any pressure at all to curtail some of those freedoms in Hong Kong and the new Hong Kong, as it were?
No, I don't think so. And not only that, but I think it's quite clear that the mainland is very keen to ensure that Hong Kong does observe those aspects of its laws that reflect human rights principles. One of the provisions of the Basic Law is that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which applied to Hong Kong before 1997, shall continue to apply afterwards. And one of the provisions of that convention is that there shall be a report on a regular basis to the committee in Geneva of the way in which a jurisdiction is complying with that convention. Now, China's not a party to that convention, and it's nonetheless, China accepts the responsibility to report on compliance by Hong Kong and indeed Macau in respect of that convention, and ensures that the report from Hong Kong is furnished to the committee and attends the reporting session. At the reporting session, there is a formal head of delegation who is a Chinese diplomat, but the answers to questions are provided entirely by members of the Hong Kong civil service.
Well, let's talk about immigration. We know that when the change did take over, that there were a lot of people who left Hong Kong. Who are you seeing as immigrating into Hong Kong now?
There's always been a significant international community in Hong Kong because Hong Kong has a relatively free immigration policy. If you can get a job if there is a job available for somebody from outside Hong Kong for which there isn't a local person who can do the job, then the immigration department will permit somebody to come in with an employment visa and work. That has meant that international banks, international law firms have had no difficulty bringing in staff from overseas. And it's why Hong Kong is such a good base for both banking and international law, providing legal services for countries throughout the region.
So Hong Kong is still open for business, willing for business, and right there?
Yes, there is a huge amount of international interchange, and I've detected no downturn in the numbers of people coming from other jurisdictions. In fact, in recent years, since the big financial crisis, it seems to have positively been an increase, because I think people recognize Hong Kong as a place that has potential for expansion, possibly rather more quickly than a number of other jurisdictions.
Copyright law.
I think Hong Kong did have a bad reputation for piracy in the past. But in recent years, there's been a determined effort on part of the government, particularly the Customs and Excise Department, to ensure that Hong Kong fully complies with its obligations in respect of copyright and enforces copyright in a very strenuous way. I know there has been full cooperation between the Hong Kong authorities and the customs from the United States. And I think that now there is almost no locally produced pirated material in Hong Kong. There is pirated material in other jurisdictions, obviously, which could be available in Hong Kong. But generally speaking, Hong Kong has been a very, very strong partner in the battle against copyright piracy.
Well, Western-based human rights activists have long decried the human rights situation in China. Tell me, what pressures does Chinese policy create for Hong Kong in areas like this?
The big pressure in Hong Kong in the time that I've been there from human rights activists has been in relation to two different aspects of immigration. One in relation to immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers from Vietnam, and the other for people seeking reunification from China, the mainland, who were born outside Hong Kong and who wished to join family members within Hong Kong. The policy in respect of refugees and asylum seekers has always been that Hong Kong, the International Convention on Refugees, doesn't apply to Hong Kong, although it does apply to the rest of China. And Hong Kong has always taken the view that although it will never turn an asylum seeker away, if a person is given refugee status by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, then that person must be resettled somewhere else. We don't accept refugees for settlement in Hong Kong, although we are prepared to give them temporary asylum while their status is determined. So that's always caused a certain amount of trouble. And in the period leading up to 1997, there were a large number of Vietnamese asylum seekers, and the government's policy at that time was to return them after they had been screened. If they were screened out as not being refugees, then they had to be returned to Vietnam, and that caused a certain amount of difficulty. It was successfully implemented, however, and so that by the end there were only a residual 2,000 or 3,000 asylum seekers who had to be finally settled in Hong Kong. The difficulty in relation to children born outside Hong Kong was in the years, the 20, 30 years before reunification, a large number of people had come from the mainland as illegal immigrants, and under the policy that applied up to 1980, they were allowed to settle in Hong Kong. They were disproportionately men, and many of them either had wives and children already back in the mainland, or they returned to the mainland to get married. So they had children born in the mainland. Now, under the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, those people, the children born in the mainland, didn't automatically have a right to come to Hong Kong, but they had to first seek the permission of the central government. There was a policy to allow 150 people from the mainland to enter Hong Kong for settlement every day, which works out at 54,500 a year. But in the period immediately before 1997, there was a question as to the interpretation of the Basic Law, as to whether, if a person had a parent who came to Hong Kong after they were born, whether the status of being the child of a person who had got permanent resident status in Hong Kong would then be conferred on the child. So that was a big issue, and in the period leading up to 1997 we got a number of people coming in illegally into Hong Kong who sought to remain there and not be returned.
What about human trafficking?
It's, as far as I'm aware, there is little or no trafficking through Hong Kong for prostitution. There will be inevitably people who do go through Hong Kong for that purpose, but as to whether it's organised in or through Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong is minimal as a transshipment point for prostitution. I know it's something that has been of concern to the US government over the years, but we've always been slightly puzzled by it as being a major feature of any report to Congress, because we don't think that it is a significant problem. There may be instances, but not a significant problem.
Business seems to be the main goal. Why is Hong Kong such a fabulous place for banking?
Well, I think it's the combination of the rule of law as being the basis on which foreign corporations, and particularly banks, can be assured that their contracts will be respected. Its location, the fact that it's close to China, the mainland, and has all the opportunities for investment through Hong Kong. Time zone is important too. It fits conveniently into a 1/3 division of the world into 3 separate time zones: London, New York, and Hong Kong. It's extremely open in terms of its financial arrangements. I've already mentioned the immigration arrangements, so that international bankers can come and go reasonably freely. And all these are beneficial.
What about the death penalty? Unlike China, do you still have a ban on the death penalty in Hong Kong?
Well, there is no death penalty in Hong Kong. It was abolished. I've forgotten exactly when. 1993. It was abolished after many years of never having been implemented. And it was abolished in some ways by accident, that a local member of the Legislative Council introduced a resolution to say that the death penalty in future should be implemented and not commuted, as it had always been ever since the death penalty was abolished in the UK, which was in the 1960s. So that motion was introduced in the legislature. The government members of the legislature at that time didn't vote. They left it to a free vote of local legislators, and they all voted almost, apart from the person that had introduced it, by an overwhelming majority against the motion, in other words, in favour of the abolition of the death penalty. And the government then had the courage to actually formally abolish it. So it was formally abolished, and there's been no pressure at all to reintroduce it. What it means, it's not only of reassurance, I think, to those jurisdictions that don't have the death penalty, which is mostly the European community, but it's also an important factor in our relation to our international relations or external affairs with other jurisdictions, is that when we have an extradition treaty, we have to make arrangements to ensure that anybody who is returned from Hong Kong to another jurisdiction is not subject to the death penalty in that jurisdiction. As you'll appreciate, that causes difficulties with some jurisdictions which have retained the death penalty in certain circumstances. But we've always managed to obtain assurances from those jurisdictions that the death penalty, even if passed, will not be implemented.
And finally, you seem to be an eyewitness for some of the most amazing events that happen in our world, and certainly in my lifetime. Let me get some of your thoughts on what is happening right now in Egypt and the Middle East.
Well, this is only a personal view, of course, not in my view. When I first started watching the events in Egypt, it took me back very much to 1989, because in May 1989 I was in Beijing, but I went to Tiananmen Square and saw students. It seemed to me at the time that the mainland authorities were taking a very relaxed, or at least sensible view of things, and that eventually things would dissipate and revert to normal without any bloodshed. Unfortunately, of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. I think a number of people on the news also reflected on this as being a possible outcome in Egypt. I think that in Egypt it's quite clear that there is now a degree of uncertainty as to what the next step is going to be. So I think it's very easy to demonstrate and demand the change of government, but unless you've actually got some system for introducing something to replace the existing regime, you can achieve the change, but you can't necessarily get something better. I appreciate that's sort of better the devil you know argument, but I mean it does mean that it's terribly simple, particularly for countries in the West, to support change without really having a very clear idea as to where it's going to lead. And I think that's true of all the North African Gulf countries.
Well, Mr. Wingfield, any final thoughts?
Well, I've had the opportunity to serve in the Hong Kong government for almost 30 years, and it's been an extremely exciting and an interesting time, and it's certainly not something I'd envisaged when I first went to Hong Kong in 1982. Like most expatriates, I'd anticipated only being there for 3 years, and it turned out to be a lifetime career.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
A special thanks to the Open Journal staff for their cooperation with today's broadcast, and a special thanks to Kirby Roberts for her help. I'm MArlo Blue, and on behalf of KPFT 90.1 FM in Houston Open Journal, thank you. You're listening to KPFT 90.1 FM in Houston, 89.5 in Galveston, and 89.7 in Huntsville. And now, back to our interview with Mr. Ian Wingfield, former Solicitor General of Hong Kong. Well, What kind of pressures are there from Chinese government regarding things like human rights or censorship? Is there any pressure at all to curtail some of those freedoms in Hong Kong and the new Hong Kong, as it were?
No, I don't think so. And not only that, but I think it's quite clear that the mainland is very keen to ensure that Hong Kong does observe those aspects of its laws that reflect human rights principles. One of the provisions of the Basic Law is that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which applied to Hong Kong before 1997, shall continue to apply afterwards. And one of the provisions
did take over, that there were a lot of people who left Hong Kong. Who are you seeing as immigrating into Hong Kong now?
There's always been a significant international community in Hong Kong because Hong Kong has a relatively free immigration policy. If you can get a job if there is a job available for somebody from outside Hong Kong for which there isn't a local person who can do the jobs of that convention, is that there shall be a report on a regular basis to the committee in Geneva of the way in which a jurisdiction is complying with that convention. Now, China's not a party to that convention, and it's nonetheless, China accepts the responsibility to report on compliance by Hong Kong and indeed Macau in respect of that convention, and ensures that the report from Hong Kong is furnished to the committee and attends the reporting session. At the reporting session, there is a formal head of delegation who is a Chinese diplomat, but the answers to questions are provided entirely by members of the Hong Kong civil service.
Well, let's talk about immigration. We know that when the change